There we go. Better. Okay, welcome back. All right, so we're back in Intro to Social Methods. So we're going to keep talking today about quantitative research, right? Kind of setting up a quantitative research project. If we get through that, we're going to start looking at survey design. I'm sure it's as exciting for you as it is for me. I love survey design, actually. I think it's awesome. It's amazing fun, and I've had great fun with, this sounds crazy, but I've had great fun with friends of mine as we critique each other's surveys and try to work through stuff. So I like survey design a lot. Looking forward to getting to it. Before I start, the department asked me to promote something. And usually when people ask me to promote things, I say no, because I'm taciturn at best. And I'm not going to waste class time on the Golden Nugget Club or whatever. I don't care. Anytime anyone is like, can I come talk to your class? I'm like, no, just flat out, I don't want you to. It's like, can I give a 2-minute talk about no, I don't care. But this one actually I think is useful and relates up, I think, to the course content. So I don't know if you're aware. If you are, great. If you're not, okay. That the department offers a certificate in applied social science research, right? So, it's an add-on to your degree, right? So you would get a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor of Science, depending what program you're in. And you could have, with a certificate added on to the degree, right? This particular one, it's all about research skills. Particularly, there's a lot of stats, right? You have to do quite a bit of stats. But it is really in demand. And I can say this, without any reservation, when people are ask me what should I do, to make sure that I get a job coming out of university, I'm like, this is a good option, our certificate in applied social science research, especially if you lean into it. And I know it sounds depressing and difficult if you lean into the statistics part of it. Why? Because there is a ton of employment at the private sector level, the government level, in terms of looking for people who are competent, with things like R, things like SPSS, and just basically ways of doing social science research. You can, I think, get a job more easily, and it's a skill set. When you go and put your resume out there after you apply, after you're done university, and you say, hey, I've got these skills that I developed in my certificate in applied social science research. And I mean, in a sense, you've already, by the time you finish this course, right, you'll have already kind of completed the first two requirements. So you're halfway there. Okay, maybe not, but you're getting closer, right? Advanced methods or statistics courses, right? So some of these are in qualitative methods too. So if you want to avoid the quantitative side, but again, I think if you're future thinking, it doesn't hurt to do stats and do more stats. So I think it's useful, and then you get to do so 415 a applied research internship, right? Again, internships are great, look great on your CV. Or 3-unit capstone social science research project. I can't remember, there's a course number that's associated with it, and I'm on the undergraduate teaching commission or committee, and I should know what it is, but I have absolutely no idea. That's how dedicated I am to my job. I haven't memorized the whole catalog yet, but yeah, I mean, there's an honors project if you do an honors sociology degree, or there's an independent research study course that we have. Like I said, I can't remember the number, but it is there. And yeah, you have to do a little public presentation, and usually at the end of the winter term, we have a poster presentation where people can do that. So, I mean, great. I think it's really good. It could be helpful to you, in the job market, an actual skill set, especially with arts, right? Coming out with a BA. Believe me, I've looked at all the depressing work statistics. If you come out with just a BA, what was the old joke that the engineers used to say about, BA, do you want fries with that? Right, pointing to actual skills that you have, right? So you're not quite doing a vocational program, but you can point to some concrete skills And I think it's well worth your time, especially if you're early in your degree, to kind of pivot in this direction if you're so inclined. Bit.ly, SOS Casser, or contact Michelle Morato. If you don't know Michelle, Michelle is amazing, great professor in the department, lovely person, and really, she's the certificate advisor, and she's done a great job taking this kind of from 0 to 60 in like the past 6 or 7 years. And she's a wonderful colleague, wonderful person, casser@ualberta.ca if you're interested, right? And like I said, never hurts to have these little certificates tacked on to a BA, especially because, you're pointing to, well, I did something concrete in my undergraduate degree. I didn't just take, up to 300 level courses in sociology where all you had was multiple choice exams, which is what some people think. Do you have a question?
I don't know if you can answer this. Can we take multiple certificates, right?
I think there might be a max of two, but I'm not sure. But I've seen people certainly in graduating classes with multiple certificates. There's a lot of requirements when you start getting into certificates, so it might be like a 5-year degree, but that might, you might judge that to be worth it too, right? So I think the maximum is 2 because I think they want you to graduate at some point, maybe. I mean, the university does love taking your money and later on asking for your money. So technically I'm an alumnus, right? Because I graduated from here twice, undergrad and PhD. And I get these letters like, hey, would you like to give us more money? I'm like, no. I still work here and I have to pay for parking. That is my monthly contribution to the university, is my parking fees. Can't even give me a parking pass for working here, which I guess is fair, but also grumpy. All right, anyway, my struggle. I'm like, I'm not giving you any more money. Come on. Like, you could help a starving undergraduate student actually eat ramen this month. Also, the president could buy a new Bentley. Like, wait. Which one of those things do I care about? All right, we're good. Any other questions about this? Definitely worth looking into if you're so inclined. All right. No? Okay. Now, you've probably seen this in 5 classes now, so I'm sorry. Oh, right. Which class am I teaching today? This one. I was also trying to get ahead on amalgamating the slides, so here we go. All right. I think we sort of ended off our class last time talking about my friend and yours, the thing I don't know how to pronounce, the Likert scale or the Likert scale. I've heard people use both pronunciations, and I still don't know which one's technically correct. Maybe one of them, if you say it in a British accent, is the right one. I don't know. All right. These kinds of scales are really, really useful. So again, when you're thinking about designing your major lab project, and you're putting together a survey, something like this, and I would like you to put in, sometimes people just put questions and it's not clear if they have a scale in mind or it's like an open-ended question. I'd like you to put in the answers, if possible, unless it's actually like an open-ended question, which, is a different thing. We'll talk about that on the next slide. These kinds of scales are really useful, and I know I said this last time, and I'm just repeating myself because that was Thursday and now it's Tuesday, and a weekend went by and things were forgotten, maybe. The reason that they're used commonly, I know I said this, is that they're easy, right? They're really, really simple for people to understand, because one of the biggest problems you have when you're doing a survey is people will get frustrated and quit if the survey is too demanding, right? If it's taking them a long time, I do this as a kind of semi-hobby, right? I've signed up for things like LegerWeb, where you can do surveys, and if you do enough of them, you earn rewards, which you can trade in for gift cards or something like that, right? Takes forever, but it's fun anyway. I bought a PlayStation with it at one point, and then I kind of petered off. But it is useful because I like to go through and see other people's surveys, and it's not an unfrequent thing for even me, and I have a great deal of patience for survey writers to rage quit surveys because I'm like, okay, the survey is stupid, it's badly written, goodbye. And I'm done, right? And then they're like, you didn't complete the survey. Would you like to? No, I don't want to complete your survey. These kinds of scales are useful in avoiding that kind of thing, right? Because all the person has to figure out is what the question is asking, right? And you're usually using a statement and something like strongly agree. There are other ways to use Likert scales that don't involve a statement, but statements are your safest one, and strongly agree to strongly disagree. And it just is simple, right? Because you read the question and you already know kind of where you fall. You don't have to necessarily reread the answers every single time. One of the really common mistakes people make, and this is even professional survey writers, because I see this on Leger all the time, is that every question or every 2 or 3 questions has different answer sets. And it gets incredibly frustrating and tiring for the person doing your survey because they're trying to understand your question and they're trying to understand your answers. So Likert scales, kind of avoid that, right? Because you can have a consistent answer set and you can use it for large chunks of a survey, right? Now, it does mean you have to phrase things in particular ways, right? You do have to, make statements, right? And again, these are examples of questions I used. So, the survey went pretty well. We had actually a pretty low termination rate of only about 20% of people who started didn't finish it. So I was pretty happy with that. 80% of those who began ended the survey. It also only took like 15 minutes, which was another thing that is helpful. But yeah, so that's why we use these kinds of scales, right? And there are, of course, some limitations. Sometimes you can't get all the nuance that you want out of something like a scale like this, but you're having a much higher chance of someone actually completing the survey that you create. And it is not, I will say this, I've more than once on a major lab assignment where someone gives me these impossibly complex answer sets, been like, at question 4, I'm like, I quit. I use the comment feature in Word, and I'm like, at this point, I'm frustrated with this survey already, and I'm quitting. And so, 3. Satisfactory, but not great, right? So, just keep that in mind when you're I know I'm like trying to scare you all. I just wanted to steer you in the direction I want you to go. They're useful for this. Okay, so we talked about this last time. I don't think, hopefully there are no questions. Well, are there questions? I shouldn't say hopefully there are no questions. Questions? Nay? All right. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. All right, so unstructured data is a pain. Unstructured data is a pain. Okay, so what is unstructured data, right? So generally speaking, unstructured data in kind of quantitative research, you'll see this I'll say you'll see this principally on surveys where you might, in your foolish attempt to elicit some kind of nuance from a survey, do like an open comm box where it's like, could you tell us your opinion in words on this sort of thing? And so what ends up happening, right, is you get people typing all sorts of things into comm boxes. Or so, I guess when we were doing phone interviews, right, the phone interviewer would ask the person like, hey, do you tell me your thoughts about this in your own words? And then you'd have to like transcribe that and, basically code it. But basically you're talking about, open-ended questions where people can enter almost anything as their answers, which means in order to make sense of it, you have to give it some kind of structure, right? So we're going to talk more about coding, and I'll show you a little bit what it looks like in software. Because typically, I'm a bad example because I did all my coding on my qualitative stuff in Word. I just created the categories and I mostly remember where stuff is because that's the crazy, stupid brain I've got. But like in general terms, you're using some kind of software. The popular one right now is one called NVivo, like literally the letter N and Vivo, V-I-V-O. I should know this. I end up paying for it on my corporate credit card like 6 times a term for grad students. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. And basically what you do is you create a bunch of codes, right? So you create a bunch of like, okay, this statement falls into the category of, people who love coffee because of the flavor, and this one is people who love coffee because of the effects, and this one is people who hate coffee, right, or whatever. You would come up with a whole bunch. Those are terrible codes, by the way, but I'm making this up as I go. And then you basically would, in quantitative research, assign each of those codes a numerical value, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and you would more or less just count how many people made these sorts of statements, right? Yeah, I mean, kind of basic principles, and we'll see this, again, when we talk about qualitative data. The categories can't overlap, right? So you should have mutually exclusive categories. You should have, the categories have to be exhaustive. So all of your responses have to be categorized in some way by your codes, right? So there can't be a case that's just left out. And yeah, generally, especially when you have multiple people working with data, you want clear rules for how codes are applied, right? So how, what kind of statements are going to fall into this category, fall into that category. And I will say this, tremendous pain in the butt, especially say you're working on a great big project and you maybe have like the project we're going to be working on in the Center for Criminological Research. We got like 15 grad students that are going to be like transcribing and coding data. And you've got to have a really clear code book as to what the codes are. And what else? They have to be applied really, really, really consistently by everyone who's coding data, or you end up with a complete, giant, ugly, stupid, irritating mess that some administrator somewhere, probably me, ends up having to go in and clean up. So it has to be really clear how codes are applied, because intersubjectivity, right, where different people interpret different things as either the same or different codes, can cause you no end of headaches in data analysis when you do it later on. So unstructured data, my temptation always is to just like leave it out. I'm like, deal with it in qualitative research, leave it out of quantitative research altogether. Not everybody agrees. I'm somewhat, say, not work averse, but annoyance averse. And I find these types of processes kind of annoying. Okay, so, reliability. Okay, so reliability, reliability is one of these terms basically concerned with the consistency of measures, right? So you really want, when you're measuring something in quantitative research, for you to basically have a consistent measurement, right? So that you're always measuring, you're measuring it consistently the same way and getting roughly similar results, right? There are kind of three different meanings that sometimes get applied to reliability in sociological research. Stability over time, and this would be the example of like, okay, you get on a bathroom scale and it gives you the same result roughly over and over again, right? So you step on 180 pounds or 130 pounds, whatever you weigh, 100, and it always gives you roughly the same result, right? Because it's measuring the same thing, right? It's measuring it, and it's measuring it consistently. That's the kind of stability over time, right? You're getting consistent results over time using the same tool set. Internal reliability, right? This is more, it's consistent within a kind of range, right? You've got basically within the kind of range of the project, it would be reliable. Outside of the project, you might get different results, right? So internal reliability, basically within your study, you're getting a kind of consistent way of measuring things and consistent results overall. And then interobserver consistency. This one's basically more like if you had multiple people using a similar method or procedure, they would all get relatively consistent results, right? That's basically reliability. You want basically in some way to be getting consistent measurement. Okay, like target A. Good reliability, right? You're measuring all the same things, but it's off. You're measuring it incorrectly. You'd have poor validity. Poor validity, poor reliability, right? You've got things all over the place. Your measurements are all over. And then good validity, good reliability. You are measuring what you want, and you're getting the results reliably. It's pretty consistent in its clustering. So that's what the targets indicate there. Okay, all right, I had these all on slides. So stability over time, I guess I explained this, right? But the results measure whether the results of a measure fluctuate as time progresses, assuming that what is being measured is not changing, right? You would have, if they fluctuate too much, then you wouldn't have good reliability. Yeah, you can use retest methods in order to test reliability, right? So you can do it once and then do it again, right? So you do, yeah, consumer test, retest reliability, right? You have someone, the customer, do a test at time 1 and then at time 2, and things should be roughly kind of stable. If they're not, you know that you maybe have issues with stability over time. And yeah, it's hard to it's hard to quantify stability over time because of a number of factors that may come into play over the passage of time, right? Like even with the example of measuring like a person's weight, right? A person's weight theoretically fluctuates even based on things like water intake. So you could have, you know, a relatively reliable tool, but your measurements would still fluctuate because, you know, somebody had too many of those Hawkins cheesies one day and then they retained a bunch of water, right? Because they're pure salt. Hopefully that makes sense. Sense making? Okay. No, that's not a question. They're just stretching? Okay, good. Yeah, so internal reliability or consistency, whether multiple measures that are administered in one sitting are consistent, right? So within a kind of limited scope, you know, whether you're getting sort of consistent results. I wouldn't worry too much about this, right? But when you're doing some of the fancy stats to check for reliability, you could use Cronbach's alpha coefficient or the split half method to do the calculations. Right now, I mean, you don't even really, in a lot of cases, you don't even really need to know what those are because like it's built into SPSS. So you can just like menu select, you know, Cronbach's alpha coefficient and boom, there you go. Yeah, correlation of 0.8 or higher on a scale is generally accepted as the minimum internal reliability, right? Any figures lower than that tend to be seen as less reliable, though people still use them, right? So yeah, using you know, Cronbach's alpha, any result lower than 0.8, people will say, well, these weren't the best reliable results. We still use them, right? It's like, you know, when you're using something like Pearson. Should I talk? I'm not going to talk statistics. No, forget it. I was going to tell you how that compares to Pearson's R, but let's not talk about that. Okay. No. Bad. I said no statistics. Bad, Broussard. No cookie for you today. Okay. I made promises. All right. Interobserver consistency. Yeah, so all observers should classify the behavior or attitudes in the same way, right? So if you're looking at you know, using the same procedure, everybody should come up with two relatively similar results, right? So the example from the textbook, 2 observers are recording the amount of aggression children display on a particular playground. Their estimates should roughly agree, right? Because if it's like an act of aggression is when one child hits another one with a ball or something, I don't know. Or with a ball or fist or something, or raises their voice beyond 15 decibel. I don't even know. This is a really particular kind of research that we'll talk about at the end of the quantitative unit. But yeah, I mean, 2 people using the same tool set should come up with roughly the same results, or 15 people using the same tool set should have comparably reliable results. Okay, I know, super exciting stuff. Measurement validity. Okay, yeah, I mean, basically, whether you're measuring what you want to measure, right? That's what's kind of locked into measurement validity. And here, the weight example is actually an interesting one. I heard this over the weekend and I was like, oh yeah, that's a good example of measurement validity, right? Let's say that your scale is reading, 200, but you actually weigh 180, right? And every time you step on that scale, it's measuring 200. Well, that is a reliable measure, right? Because you're getting the same measure all the time, but it wouldn't be valid because it's not actually measuring your true weight. It's measuring your weight plus 20 pounds, right? So it's not a valid measure, right? Your weight is 20 pounds less than what is actually being measured. So it's reliable because you get the similar results all the time, but it's not valid, right? So that's one way of thinking about validity. Are you measuring correctly what you're trying to measure, right? And weight there actually is a good one. Okay, that said, there are various kinds of measurement validity: face validity, concurrent validity, construct validity, and convergent validity. And I got a slide for like each of these. well, I guess this one has 2. Okay, so face validity. So just on the face of it, right? So like, I know I shouldn't use face to define face validity. Like surface appearance, right? If you were just to explain to a lay person what you're attempting to measure, they would probably agree with you that you're measuring the right thing, right? That you're kind of come up, that you're going to properly measure what you're trying to measure, right? So, I mean, on its face, stepping on a bathroom scale has face validity in terms of measuring weight, right? If you want to measure religiosity, right, religious service attendance on its face seems to be a valid measure of religiosity, right? So, right, just like on the surface, like without digging any deeper, giving it no further thought, does it measure what you're trying to measure? Now, sometimes the problem with face validity is sometimes face validity takes you in an unhelpful direction, right? And I know a few people in the class on their first assignment sort of proposed academic achievement by basically asking people for their GPA. And, on its face, GPA probably seems like it has face validity, right? That is academic achievement, right? That's their grades. That's how well they're doing. Okay, I mean, the problem is sometimes things that have face validity might not be the best tool for measuring something. They might be too broad, right? I think I said, maybe I might have thrown people off. I got a few panicked emails. A little bit too crude. I said crude because it's like very infrequent measures of something. But, right, on its face, GPA would seem to measure academic achievement or academic performance in some way, right? So, I mean, when you're thinking of, the measurements that you're trying to do, right, you're trying to operationalize your variables, you'll have to think, okay, on its face, does this, on its face, measure what I want it to measure? And it's just a good exercise to be like, or am I actually measuring something else, right? Okay. So, concurrent validity, yeah, a little bit more abstract, right? Established if the measure correlates with some criterion thought to be relative to the concept, right? When you don't see correlation, then you would wonder if you've got concurrent validity, right, of the original measure. Okay, so I mean, what might this look like? Let me think. It's just a quick thought experiment here. Let's go back to religiosity, right? Let's say that you wanted to measure someone's religiosity, and you said, do you consider yourself spiritual, right? And you had or I consider myself spiritual. We'll go with a Likert scale. Strongly agree to strongly disagree, right? What you might find is that, on the face of it, religion involves spirituality, so it fits maybe the face validity definition. But you might not see a correlation with other criterion, thought to be relevant, right? So, like, okay, does the person consider themselves spiritual? Okay. How does that kind of interact with, say, questions about religious service attendance, right? Because someone could be spiritual but not religious and consider themselves spiritual, but not ultimately then be involved in frequent religious activity, whether that's, religious service attendance, frequency of prayer, holy books, those sorts of things, right? So, lack of correlation between, say, spirituality and religious service attendance could point you to the fact that one of these measures is not measuring the thing that you want it to measure, right? That, say, considering yourself spiritual might, in fact, be measuring something else, right? It might be measuring a different concept than religiosity. It will say spirituality here, or propensity to buy Reiki crystals off Amazon. I don't know. Okay. Sorry, does that all make sense? Before I move on. Yay. Okay, I know. Most exciting terms ever. Construct validity. Yeah, so basically construct validity established if the concepts relate to each other in a way that is consistent with the researcher's theory. Yeah, confirmed by seeing that results match what would be predicted given the theory, right? So, here it's kind of internal to, again, so you're coming up with your hypothesis as to how things are working, right? Before you do, say, data gathering. And you might theorize that, religious service attendance, again, I'm using religiosity because I know the measures really well. Religious service attendance, frequency of prayer, frequency of interaction with holy texts. Basically, you might have your theory saying, okay, all of these things basically are measures of religiosity, so that as we see more of these activities, we can class the person as more religious. And then, if it all kind of works that way internally to the theory, right? So the construct that you've built, it all kind of fits the way you've framed it. Then, you would say it has construct validity. Now, you can get yourself into trouble using this kind of measure of validity as well, because maybe you came up with a very esoteric kind of theory, right? Or eccentric kind of theory of how a particular phenomenon works. And so, I don't know, let me think here. You think of like you class people, say, as politically informed if they vote, for a liberal political party and read at least, or say follow at least 5 of these people on Twitter. And you could find that, yes, these people are all, vote this particular way, they vote liberal or democratic or whatever, and they tend to follow these same people. So you could come up with a really weird kind of way that might look valid based on the construct, but your theory might be stupid, right? So just to put it that way, I came up with what I thought was a fairly ridiculous example, right? Or, I don't know, that, fear of clowns is related to people who are interested in studying ecology, right? And within your own construct, maybe you can find a way to make that valid, but it's a really stupid kind of theory. So you have to be careful if you've used a similar kind of construct and that you're not just making it up. Because there is the chance that you could be like, well, construct validity, it had it. So, I passed the validity test. Okay. And then convergent validity, our last one. Yeah, so basically, establish if a measure of a concept correlates with a second measure of the concept that uses a different measurement technique, right? So here, you might have your survey-based kind of tool that matches, say, I'm not thinking to pull, it's not, so you see it in, say, a survey, but then you also kind of find it in structured observation. That's the term I was looking for, right? So you're like, violence in children. I have this measure which, I asked the children, of course, with consent of their parents, how often do you feel angry? And then, you go and do structured observation where you sit on the playground and observe little Johnny beating the snot out of some other kid. And you're like, my 2 tools I use to measure Johnny's aggression suggests that I have, convergent validity. I've used 2 different tools, a survey and structured observation. We'll talk structured observation later. Don't worry about it. And you've got 2 different measurement techniques finding the same thing, right? So you're like, I categorize, let's say this group of suburban children as highly aggressive because they have helicopter parents. And then I do structured observation and I find that, in fact, yes, they're at the soccer game. This team of 8-year-old girls is doing bicycle kicks on their opponent's heads. So I find that my measures have lined up, right? So that's convergent validity, like 2 different ways of measuring and coming up with the same sort of results that back each other up, right? There's a correlation between them. Okay, I don't know, that's a lot. How are you doing? Yeah, please.
So what is validity? I don't know if this is a stupid question. Is there just one kind of validity per test, or can you have multiple?
You could have multiple, right? And most of the time, at very least, you should have face validity and one of these other methods, right? Now, but you could have you could have Construct validity, right, within your theory, and convergent validity at the same time, right? They're not mutually exclusive. They're just different ways of kind of testing validity. But yeah, like I said, most things at very least should have two, right? Where you have at least face validity and something else. Because if you don't have face validity, and it's not sort of obvious that you're measuring the right things, then you've traveled into uncharted waters. And I don't, like, it's like pair consumption is related to aggression. It's like that fails face validity. Even if you can find some kind of like, construct validity that measures that, it's like, yeah, on the face of it, I don't understand how pairs and aggression are related, right? Yeah, please.
So then does that mean you could use convergent validity to be like, well, I have face validity and one other validity, or does face not count?
No, I mean, I think face validity counts. And I just think like face validity would be kind of the lowest hanging fruit, right? It's the easiest one to establish because it's sort of in layman's terms, right? Simply put in very simple terms, people should obviously recognize that you're at least setting up your measurement in a way that makes sense. Does that answer your question? Okay, please.
Which is the best type of validity to use?
Oh, the best. I don't know that there's really a best or worst one. I mean, my temptation is to say I like concurrent validity. I think it's especially, okay, because I'm saying also that survey research is one that we use quite a bit. It's one that's relatively easy to establish. And it's one, like, again, I don't want to say the other ones, like, it's not that these two are bad, right? It's a different way of thinking. I think there's more room for error with construct validity because it's like, it's internal to a theory. And I think there's a lot of space for people to, like, there's monkey business space in here where you can screw around and get a kind of construct validity in a way that might fail other tests. And convergent validity, I think, is sometimes more difficult to establish because you need two very distinct kind of measurements, right? Now, I mean, I suppose even here, like in convergent validity, I gave you two very different methods. You could, in theory, get convergent validity even on a survey if you're using two different tools within a survey. Say you've got one that's a Licor Scale and one that is like a ranked number scale. Like sometimes people do like rank this between 1 and 10. It's probably lower in terms of convergent validity. I think that one tends to be hard to establish because you do need two different measurements, and not all concepts are easily measured in two different ways. So yeah, I mean, if I was to say concurrent validity is probably the easiest one, yeah, basically, your measurement correlates to some other criterion thought to be relevant to the concept. It's fairly easy to think of two concepts that should be measuring the same thing, right? Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. Other questions? So, yeah.
So back to your example of validity and reliability of the weight scale, considered reliable but not valid. So if the weight scale was like 200 and you were getting 170 or 165, how do you tell whether it's reliable or not? There's roughly similar. Is that a set scale or is it just your own perception?
Okay, so if I understand your question, it's like if you're, that you weigh 200 pounds and you step on the scale and it gives you 165 and it does it consistently, well, you might want to figure out another way of measuring your weight. Maybe see if you're heavier than a duck. No, sorry, that's a Monty Python joke. Do you float when you're thrown into water? Are you in fact a witch? That's the thing that's judging. So the witch test in Monty Python, whether the person is heavier than a duck, would not be a valid measure. Might be reliable, but not valid. I should use that example in the future. Anyway, I should show that clip. But yeah, I mean, you'd want to figure out a better measurement tool, right? So maybe you go to the doctor's office and you use a properly calibrated scale that would give you then, a better measurement because it's probable that your scale's battery is low or that maybe because it depresses you to see your actual weight, you've set it, or that's me, you've tinkered with the software and you've set it to always show you consistently lower than you are. And then you never visit the doctor because you don't actually want to know. All right. Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right. So Right. So a measure that is not reliable will not be valid, right? Not reliable or valid. It's all over the place, right? An inconsistency in the way data is gathered makes data more or less usable, right? So yeah, I mean, if you're, again, like if you're getting kind of results that are all over the place, it's probable that your tool is, whatever you're using is kind of failing, right? So yeah, in cases where you've got even, sorry, if you have no reliability, right, your data is all over the place, it's not going to be valid. So you need to fix the kind of way you're measuring something. A measure, as we've been talking about, can be invalid but still reliable, right? So you've got your cluster of data over here, but it's not measuring the proper thing, not valid, right? Reliable but not valid. So you're aiming for both, right? You're aiming to get on that bathroom scale, and no matter how depressing the number at 41 years old, they get more and more depressing. Let me tell you, it's probably the potato chips more than the age. But you want it to give you those results, no matter how depressing they might be, and you want it to be valid and reliable. That's the goal. Once you have both of those things, you've kind of done it correctly. But yeah, it'll kind of make sense, and you can use the data, and you've done the research correctly. Yeah, so data gathered for a research project may be invalid because it doesn't fit with a particular project, right? But because it was gathered properly, it may be useful to inform small facets of the research, right? So you can still sometimes use data that maybe has the reliability, but fails the validity test for other things, right? Even to inform how you then, changed your research to get better usable data. And that's happened sometimes with when people do test projects, right? And so this is, especially people doing kind of, first time research, sometimes they'll do kind of a test project, right? Where to know that your survey works or your survey tool is kind of working properly, you might pilot it out to a small group, right? So let's say, you're planning to survey Edmontonians and you're going to grab a sample of 3,000 people. You might, run it at U of A with 150, right? Just to kind of pilot it and then use that data to be like, hey, this is the error I found in my kind of measurement tool, at which point I rejiggered the measurement tool, I ditched the spirituality question and asked about, do you consider yourself religious? And that gave me a better measure, these kinds of things. Okay, does that all kind of make sense? I know you're going to get sick of hearing religion. It's the topic I know really well. So, and I've done religion research, so I kind of have a good sense of how to do it. Okay. Hot. Okay, so measurement, right? Ow. Hot water splashed my arm. Tuesday. Yeah, so measurement data used to understand or quantify a social phenomenon, right? When we're measuring something, right, we're gathering data to understand, a social phenomenon, a concept, and the interrelationship between different things, and establishing causality, right, or at least, correlation, right? Because until you've really got a ton of data, you can never really say that you have, full causality, right? Researchers want to know what causes a social phenomenon. So here, typically we say this, and I always get reminded, people are like, correlation does not equal causation. I do have a quibble with that, because if you say, I've been looking at a lot of research from Jonathan Haidt. Haidt is a psychologist, and he's been working on kind of the relationship between mental illness in adolescence and technology use, particularly smartphones. And Haidt gets kind of annoyed because people will critique his work and be like, well, Jonathan should know, given his high stature, that correlation does not equal causation. And he's like, yeah, but we have 75 studies that all tell us exactly the same thing. And technically, yes, we can't 100% say that correlation equals causation. But when you have 75 studies that all show the same correlation, you can make a pretty good guess at causation, right? So when you have like a single study, yeah, you probably want to be really careful. Even like 5 studies that all say the same thing, we see a really strong correlation between these things. When you get to a certain point and all the data points you in one direction, you can probably be pretty safe in saying, we have a good sense of the causality and probably even the directionality, right? The more research you have, the more certain you can be about the causation and the direction of causation, right? And yeah, this is what's amusing sometimes when researchers put their research on Substack, is people will be like, well, correlation doesn't equal causation. And then the research is like, of course, correlation in this case equals causation, you morons. I like taciturn academics. If you're taking social religion with me, you'll realize how much I love Rodney Stark, simply for the fact that he's kind of a jerk and insults other sociologists, and I think it's funny. So, all right, are we good with that? Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. So, generalization, right? The goal of most of our social science research is, in fact, general, especially, well, okay, I should say this, let me rephrase. In terms of quantitative research, right? The goal of quantitative research, and if you've set it up properly, right, and you've got a proper representative sample, the goal is to generalize findings to those not studied, right? Because in general, right, we want to say, all right, we got this sample, it is representative of the population, right? Like it's big enough that we've shrunk our margins of error, right? So the bigger your sample up to a certain point, the more likely you are to have, less of I'm thinking confidence interval, but that's not the term I want to use. When they say, this poll is accurate plus or minus 3%, that is I forget. The term is not jumping in my head. Right, but we want it to have as small of a margin of error, idiot. Okay. There we are. It jumped. The margin of error, right? We want as small a margin of error as possible. Why? Because the less margin of error, the more you can say that it is generalizable, right? If you have, say, a bigger margin of error, right, up to like say 5 or 10%, then there's going to be a whole bunch of things that fall outside of any generalizations you want to make, right? So yeah, the goal is to come up with law-like findings. That's maybe a little strong, that apply to a large number of people, right? Or to make general statements that, hey, we see this in our sample, and our sample is good enough that we can say that in the whole population, we will probably see the same thing, right? So that would be a measure called external validity, right? So that you should, let's say you ran the same poll, right, or the same survey, and you got a completely different pool of people, you should get roughly the same results, right? Because you've done the work correctly and you can generalize it so much that, regardless of the specific individuals, you should get, relatively similar results. This is particularly of particular concern for researchers using cross-sectional and longitudinal designs, right? So because, typically cross-sectional and longitudinal, especially survey work, you're trying to get a representative sample so you can say something about the whole society, right? I want to say, how religious Canadian society is, or, what percentage of Canadians, approve of Justin Trudeau or their political leanings or whatever, right? Or how, say, people's political affiliation changes as they age, right? You want to be able to kind of say, well, I took this sample and I can generalize it because it's big enough. So this should be what we see in the whole population, right? Lab research, experimental designs, right? This is much less of a concern, obviously, just because you're in these kind of controlled settings. So again, we're not going to talk about experimental design too much because we don't really do it. Experimental research is more about internal validity than external validity. And again, it's we'll leave that to the lesser social sciences like psychology. I keep making that dig all semester. I don't know why. Having a representative sample is critical. to generalization. We'll talk about quantitative sampling. The slides are already put together and up and ready to go for whenever we get there after survey design. Okay. And I'll tell you all about how to do this and different ways of coming up with it. All right, representative sample rate. So yeah, representatives only from the population from which it was taken, right? So only a town, the sample from a town only applies to that town, right? So if you were doing a survey of university students, that only applies to university students. You know, Edmonton, you can only generalize for Edmonton. Do a national poll, you can generalize for all Canadians, all that jazz. And yeah, probability sampling is how we do this. And again, I'll break this down for you in mind-numbing detail later on. Isn't that a great promise? But it's important. But yeah, basically a random sample drawn from a given population. A random sample doesn't guarantee representativeness of a sample group, but it improves its chances, right? Much more so than like if you pick and choose kind of people. And there's all sorts of ways that you can do this. There's different mathematical kind of formulas to get a proper sample. Okay, replication. I don't know, maybe I'll say something that'll get me into trouble. I mean, so replication, right, if we think of kind of social science as a science, you know, replication is kind of at the core of the scientific method, right? The idea that you could roughly use the same procedure that someone else already used, and you should get similar results, right? You know, in science, right, if two people test the life cycle of fruit flies using the same procedure, they should get roughly the same results because they're dealing with the same phenomena. The same kind of goes for social science, right? The idea is, you know, if we can recheck the results and do the same kind of study in the same way, we can check for biases and routine errors that people are making. And yeah, if the findings aren't the same, then you can reevaluate the methods or the findings. There's usually that. I don't want to say that people make stuff up to prove their point, but I've had a few senior academics recently tell me that they know of at least a half dozen of their colleagues that have made up findings, like projects that they worked on together, and they read the other person's publication and they're like, that is not in the data. Or I don't know, I can't tell you who this is, but very amusingly, it's like I put the data in a Dropbox that we share, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that the other person never accessed the data. So whatever they wrote, they just made up. Sorry. Which a replication would be useful, right? Even taking those same statistical findings and running them back through SPSS or R and being like, hey, did I find the same things in the data? There's actually been some prominent cases really recently. It was out of the US somewhere where someone actually just made up findings, right? And then someone requested their data to check it, ran the data again, and they're like, the thing that you said is in this data is not there, right? So replication can be important in the fact that, you know, even just redoing the research or rerunning the statistics can sometimes show you either that people made things up. Not that academics do that, but it happens more frequently than you might think. Or that there was something wrong with the methodology or the way it was administered, right? If the findings are the same, yay, happy days. Everybody give each other a high five. The other problem, and I'll say this about replication, how to put this in delicate terms. It's hard to get funding for replication studies because replication studies are boring. You know, when it comes to say, and Canada's really bad for this because our chief sources of funding are the Tri-Council, right? So SSHRC, NSERC, and CIHR. So, SSHRC and NSERC are easy, but Sahar? I don't know. CIHR, Canadian Institute of Health Research, provide the bulk of kind of funding across the country. And I can guarantee you this, if you proposed something to SSHRC or NSERC or Sahar, sometimes it's a commitment to the bit that really gets the laughs, right? If you were like, I'm going to replicate this other person's study, I almost guarantee you won't get funding, Like 99.9% of the time, they're going to look at that and say, but we want exciting new research. We don't want the same old research. We want new and fun research that we can, trumpet and be like, yes, look, Shirk funded this particular piece of research. Aren't we wonderful and fantastic? Look at what the federal government does for you. Whereas it's like, yes, Shirk funded this research to check the methodology of some other research. Doesn't quite have the same je ne sais quoi, which is French for I don't know what. And so we have a real replication crisis. Across the sciences, social sciences is especially bad for this, as people are just not doing replication. And I can tell you that one of our favorite disciplines, psychology, this is sort of an open discussion now. It's like you have all of these really esoteric and eccentric studies that come up with these really, really strange results that are then trumpeted as like absolute fact about human psychology. Yes, 48% of adult women have ADHD that was never diagnosed in childhood. And then nobody bothers to check the findings or redo the study to realize that that's probably not true. Anyway, psychology has this major problem. Sociology has it as well, but psychology is worse because it's a worse discipline. Like I said, commit to the bit. All right. Okay. So replication is important. We have a replication crisis across the social sciences. So propose and then get rejected for some kind of replication study. It'll be fun. Not for you, but for whoever reads it. Okay. Critiques of quantitative research. There's lots of them, right? I mean, amongst the more prominent ones are these, right? Humans, you're essentially trying to use a scientific kind of framework, right? The scientific method to learn things about the social world, right? So some people will say that quantitative researchers fail to distinguish people and social institutions from the natural world, right? That humans and their actions are much more unpredictable. Humans are agents, right? Humans, unless, of course, you're a hard materialist, in which case, if we're just bags of goo flying through the universe, then we probably don't have agency, but let's not delve into that philosophical debate because it'll end in nihilism. But yeah, basically, we're conscious and we're different from non-conscious entities or natural phenomena. And so that same scientific method doesn't necessarily capture the complexity of the world, right? This is usually a critique made by qualitative researchers. But you're not getting into people's identities and observations of the world and how they see things. It's like, right, because that's your job. Okay. Yeah, so therefore the methods used to study humans should be different from those used to study natural phenomena, right? Again, this is a typically qualitative. If qualitative and quantitative are held as opposite poles that fight, then this is the kind of critique you get. But yeah, quantitative researchers generally say, humans are part of nature. There's patterns that we can measure, right? There's at least a tool set that we can use to understand human behavior to some extent, even though it's not necessarily the only one. Okay. I'm like, how many slides? Oh, wow, I have more. I thought we were very much closer than that. Okay. So I forgot how many slides are here. I really spent lots of time years ago making these pretty. Okay, so measurement process. All right, other critiques, right? The measurement process produces artificial and false sense of precision and accuracy, right? Like sometimes, we think that because we're asking things with these very refined tools, right? You've spent weeks crafting your survey questions and you checked with all of your colleagues, right? And you crafted them, you reworked them, you made sure, you switched 2 words in it to make sure you thought it was perfectly clear. But you never know out in the field how people are going to interpret the same survey item, right? 2 people could read it differently because they have a different cultural lens, right? Because they have different levels of English or whatever language you're working in, right? Because maybe you used a vocabulary word that they're not aware of. That's something you should be aware of, right? Right in plain English in ways that most people can understand. These sorts of things, right? You never know out in the real world. And especially when you're dealing with 3,000 people who did a survey, right? You have really no way of knowing if everybody interpreted the same survey item the same or differently, right? So it can give you a false sense of too much precision. Yeah, the reliance on instruments and procedures produces a disjunction between research and everyday life. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here, and it's an interesting kind of question. Now, when you think of it, sometimes the idea is that, when you're doing something like a survey, and you maybe don't get into, say, the qualitative side, right? You don't interact with people. You can be very much at a remove, right, from the data, right? Sometimes people call, quantitative research derisively, like armchair sociology, right? Because you're doing it from your armchair. You don't actually get kind of in the muddy waters with people and kind of, I've lost myself in this metaphor. Let's try a different one, right? You don't get down with people and interact with them and kind of get a sense of their everyday lives, right? You're doing everything from a remove with numbers, right? So the claim for quantitative research, right? The biggest one is that it has external validity, right? That it can be generalized. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes you're at too much of a remove. Sometimes, right, manipulated independent variables are small parts of life that have short-term effects, right? You might be measuring, sometimes a very small kind of nuanced thing that you think is important in human behavior, and then you make these outsized claims. But how it actually impacts people's lives is relatively small. And yeah, I mean, this is especially true of, say, cross-sectional research. Life is a long-term, ongoing, sometimes shifting social process. So sometimes these really cross-sectional kind of single studies, capture only that moment, and they're not going to capture how things change over time or even where people came from. And so that can be really, really difficult. Real life may vary a lot from what's recorded on a survey or in an experiment, right? And there's a lot of nuance that surveys have to work really, really hard to capture, right? Because they are, in some sense, a very removed tool, right? And they're very objective in some ways, but also, they can be sometimes in the way you craft them. You can craft them in such a way as it doesn't reflect kind of real life. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, the analysis of relationships between variables, ignores people's everyday experience of how they are defined and interpreted, right? So sometimes you look at two variables and you see a correlation, but people don't experience it that way, right? What's the example here? If a researcher studies the relationship between single motherhood and poverty using a questionnaire, the experience of single motherhood is not particularly well understood. You don't understand what people's actual lives are. And sometimes you do see correlations in data that really people aren't aware of and don't really think exist, right? It's so removed from their actual experiences that they would never sort of put it that way themselves. Now that can be a good thing, right? In the sense that maybe you've uncovered a phenomenon that people aren't aware of that's affecting their lives. Or maybe you've just connected to random variables that are affected by something spurious, right? Okay. So, I mean, these are all quantitative or qualitative kind of critiques. The explanations for findings might not address how people experience things, right? So because you're not asking those qualitative questions, you don't know. Valid qualitative findings or quantitative findings can be achieved, but conclusions don't take into account what people actually feel and think, right? So these are all qualitative kind of critiques of quantitative research. It's like, yes, you're seeing these big social trends, but you're not understanding the why. And you can kind of distill all of those down into the why and how people experience those actual phenomena in their real life, right? Which is why, if you're asking me, and you're not, but I'm standing up here and you have to listen, unless you're watching a YouTube video right now. The person who didn't look up from their laptop is watching a YouTube video right now. I'm kidding. Mixed methodologies or multiple methodologies, I think, are the richest accounts because you can deal with some of these critiques of quantitative research by going and doing qualitative fieldwork. And you only need a budget of several millions of dollars in order to do it. Or so. So quantitative research, has this objectivist ontology, right? And this is another critique, obviously. People who don't agree with that objectivist ontology are going to find quantitative research to be frustrating, right? So you assume that a social reality exists and that it can be objectively measured. But a lot of qualitative people coming from a more interpretivist framework are going to say there's nothing set about the social world, right? At the end of the day, it's all just about how people interpret things. Just check the time because there's people hovering outside the door. Like, I got 14 minutes. You can't take my time. Yeah, quantitative researchers, basically say there might be a social reality that may or may not be perceived, right? And this is, sometimes you find a correlation between things that people aren't aware of, right? They're not aware of how, their upbringing or something that happened to them in youth ultimately affects decisions they make years later. And they also claim some aspects of society are fixed and hard to change, right? And that they can therefore be measured. Okay. I'm out of slides. Thankfully. Yes, please.
Where do the expenses for research come from?
Oh, everywhere and nowhere at the same time. No, it's a good question. Hang on, I'll put my last slide back up so everyone has something to look at. Lots of things cost a lot of money, right? So running a survey, for example, can be extremely expensive. So if you're doing a phone survey, you need to pay someone, or probably a group of people, to sit there and make phone calls and record the answers that people are giving, right? If you do, say, something like an online survey, those are quite expensive as well. You have to hire out, say, a company that has the platform to do it. So when I did mine, right, I went through Abacus Data, and they subcontracted stuff through different services. I think the two surveys I did, they both went through Licor, which is a polling service in Canada. And basically, I did polls of 1,600 Edmontonians, like Edmonton area people. The 1,000 one cost, I think, about $22,000. And then the smaller one, I think, was about 11,000. Yeah.
Do you have to go through that route, or can you go like on SurveyMonkey or Google side?
It is, okay, so yeah, you can. The problem being, how are you going to get people to take the survey, right? Whereas Licor and Abacus have like a pool of people that they send out surveys to, right? And they know stuff about them because you filled out like an intake form when you signed up for their online platform. So they can identify people, and there's people they have that are already willing to take surveys. Or, you have people random dialing phone numbers if you're doing a phone survey. If you just put something out on SurveyMonkey, A, the premium tier of SurveyMonkey is not cheap. But B, it's not guaranteed that if you just put it out there, people will take it. And even SurveyMonkey has a service built into it where you can recruit people to take your survey. It is, I only know this because I checked, because I built it on SurveyMonkey, and I'm like, how much would it take for SurveyMonkey to run this 1,000-person survey? And it was still something around $25,000, right? So it's not cheap, right? So getting people to take a survey is harder than just writing it and putting it out there. Sometimes if you have a good network, you might be able to get your results, but you're always risking that not enough people are going to take the survey, right? Through just snowball samples and stuff, or posting flyers up on campus, please take my survey, or whatever people do. I've seen lots of approaches. The reason I went the way I did was because I knew that if I pay Abacus the money, they're going to find me my 1,000 people, because they can't bill me if they didn't. That's our contract, right? Yeah, you had a question in the back.
Yeah, I got a little bit confused what objectivist ontology was. Do you mind just going over what the definition is?
Okay, yeah, of course. Yeah, from the beginning of the course. Objectivist ontology is basically the assumption that there is an objective world out there that you can measure, right? That it's not that basically there is a, how to put this? That the world exists, the social world exists, and you can ask questions about it and get objective results, right? Rather than the interpretivist approach, which is everything is just socially constructed, so there is nothing objective to measure when we talk about the social world. It's all just people's interpretations, right? In a sense, we don't know whether we're we're just brains in a jar or whether there's a real world out there to measure. Does that make sense? Did that clear it up for you? Okay. Other questions? How much time do I have left? 10 minutes. Nah, okay. I'm like, I can start. Like, I have the slides right here. I could like easily go, control tab and start. But I feel like there's no point in starting a new topic with 10 minutes left. That's mildly abusive of all y'all. Let's kill her 10 minutes early today, and we will pick it up. Oh, reminder, there are labs this week, right? So this week there is a lab. So do show up. Celine will be working with you on operationalization. So, a lot of you, I know because I read all of your assignments, one of the questions was, the really key thing here will be operationalization. Well, Celine is there to kind of walk you through what this looks like a little bit. And that next minor lab is due on Sunday, and that's all about operationalization.
Will she go over how to do a second data?
Yes. I have to go talk to her right now, so I will make sure that she does.
Should we clarify like any research questions with her or you?
You can do either. Like if you want to workshop it while you're in there, like one of the parts of it is like, hey, if you want, you can, talk to your peers and talk to Celine about refining that question. But if you want to talk to me about it, I'm happy to do it after class or make an appointment or any of those things. All right. And see, now it's only 8 minutes, so I'm good. Okay, and end recording.